What would happen if two of the strongest women in JJK decided to duke it out? The lioness Yuki, one of the top tiers in the modern day and an absolute beast, versus one of the highest tiers in the Heian era, Yorozu, the absolute crazy set. It's actually going to be a very close fight, unlike the Yorozu versus Yuta video, so you're definitely going to want to stick around for this one. And of course, today I'm joined with EnemyStandUser. EnemyStandUser is an absolutely great JJK YouTuber. He has a ton of reviews, analysis, breakdowns, and just a whole bunch of stuff. And Chainsaw Man reviews too. So if you're a fan of JJK or Chainsaw Man, I would highly recommend checking him out. And of course, thank you to all of the honored one and special crew members of the channel, Worstbox, Jujutsu Kaisen, and that guy Trey. Thank you guys very much. Okay, now first we're going to start with some narrative points before we actually break down how the fight would go. And of course, the biggest point is going to be speed, because Yorozu is really fast. And I mean, in theory, she should blitz Yuki pretty badly, but of course, that's if we take into account if she scales with Yuta, and I'll let EnemyStandUser actually take this one.
So Yuki's speed is actually very interesting. The most notable thing about her speed you could really stack her up against is Kenjaku. And she was pretty much going 1-to-1 with Kenjaku. And even as a baseline, she's just keeping up with Kenjaku. She even caught her by surprise a couple times. And when you think about Kenjaku and his level as a sorcerer, Kenjaku was equal hand-to-hand in terms of his combat prowess to even Gojo. That's confirmed in an interview with GEGE. So if you take into consideration Kenjaku's capability and what he can do as a sorcerer, he's extremely well-rounded. He was dodging piercing blood. He was doing all these crazy things in feet. It's not too much to go off of, but Kenjaku can react to these things. He's capable. And I feel Yuki would at least be relative to Kenjaku.
And of course, she does have the benefit of not scaling to Ryu. Now, one thing I'm going to say is, if you're someone who believes, because yes, there are a lot of people who believe this, that Yuta and Riku are physically nerfing themselves dozens of times over, and that had he wanted to, he or Riku could have instantly blitzed and one-shot Ryu Udo. This doesn't apply to you if you believe these crazy things, but with what the story's portrayed, Ryu actually scales 1-to-1 of Riku in terms of speed, strength, durability, and all of the other physical aspects. Most people say he scales a bit above it, but just to be fair, let's say they're 1-to-1. The issue is, not including Cleave or Dismantle, just purely physical stats, Sukuna does move so fast that he completely blitzes Ryu. Again, to the point that Ryu, his brain hasn't even processed that Sukuna's moved or where he's gone or what's happened, and he has physically moved behind Ryu before he's actually activated Cleave and Dismantle, so he's actually just that much faster than him. Now, the reason I bring this up is because there are people who think that Yuki scales to Yuta. If this is true, of course, Yuki gets outscaled, but thankfully for Yuki, the only direct scaling she has to Yuta is that they're of the same rank. So it's very possible that actually she, just like Kenjaku, could in theory actually just be a lot faster than characters like Ryu, Udo, and Yuta. So unlike all those characters, she actually may not be speed blitzed by 15-figure Sukuna or by Yorozu. So yeah, she actually does have that going for her. It is highballing it, but to make it more fun and to actually make it fair, I do think we should go with this.
Now, Yorozu is a top tier Heian sorcerer. She was keeping up with the best of the Heian period. Her cursed energy levels were right on par with them, and she has a lot going for her, but I feel she probably doesn't have reverse curse because it isn't explicitly said throughout the chapters. It seems like the opportunities where she could have used reverse curse, she just did not, and it was never explicitly shown. I personally feel like she doesn't have it, but maybe Kaiyo feels differently.
Yeah, so it's a very tricky situation because the only time she would have had to use reverse curse technique was after the Mahoroga cut, but unfortunately she had used up all of her liquid mail from before, the bug armor, recreated liquid mail, used the true sphere, domain expansion, and her curse technique had burnt out after the domain. So even if she did have reverse curse technique, she wouldn't have been able to use it the one time she would have needed to use it at the end of the fight. But it's one of those things that you can't confirm or deny. Again, personally, just my own, I guess, justification or headcanon is that she does, because I mean, it would be weird if one of the strongest sorcerers of the Heian era didn't. She had survived all those crazy fights without it, and of course she is a character who we've seen in verse tends to study a lot to get a lot stronger, but I could definitely see why some people think she doesn't, because again, just like EnemyStandUser said, it was never said, and it was never hinted at either. But for the sake of the video, we're gonna assume that she does have it. We will say what would happen if she doesn't in certain scenarios, but we're just gonna assume that she does have it. Again, it's just like the Yuki speed part to make it more fair and actually more interesting.
Yeah, that makes it a lot more interesting.
And this fight will be taking place in the Tomb of the Stars. It's actually where Yuki, Choso, and Tengen fought Kenjaku. The reason it's taking place here is because it's gonna let Yuki fight far more loosely, because obviously there's thousands of barriers to actually take a lot of the attack from her technique, so she can actually fight more all out.
So Yuki Tsukumo is an extremely powerful sorcerer. As you can imagine, as one of the 4 special grades, she has skills like reverse curse technique, domain expansion, she has high output, extremely high attack power. She knows the meta, she's a part of the meta, and she is a top tier. In her first and unfortunately last battle debut, she was able to get the jump on Kenjaku, completely bypasses their ability, his curses, and his defense, and blow off his arms with her punch. Yuki has a curse technique called Bambaya, which is imbuing virtual mass into herself and her curse Garuda, and it has such overwhelming mass to a point where its concept can't even be contained semantically or pragmatically. This is very dangerous because it means for most curse techniques in the series that target an opponent within concept, it simply would not work on Yuki. Her virtual mass has no actual definition and surpasses concept-based based techniques. We immediately see this with the elephant curse Ganesha, and it has the ability to remove obstacles and even mess with concepts like it did with the US soldiers. But this power was trumped by Yuki's insane mask. She even hit Kenjaku so hard that he flung into the Senuta barrier and broke the very concept of the circular definition of that barrier. From what we've seen, there is a threshold to how much virtual mask she can imbue on herself before it gets dangerously high and it actually affects her, but her mask still cannot be measured or even defined. So as a result, her attack power is among the best in the series. It can bypass an opponent's reinforcement, it would bypass many curse techniques within the series, plus with Garuda and Yuki together, you have a dangerous combo of two forces with virtual masks that aren't physically affected by said mask. So if Yuki could apply the mask of something impossible and incredibly dense, yet her own body and Garuda would still keep their normal speed and momentum because it is a concept and it is imaginary, yet its impact is very real, and we see how destructive it can be as she flails Garuda around, destroying Tengen's tomb and temple. As a drawback, the more damage Yuki takes, the more her own output from Bambaya suffers, so her curse technique does less damage on impact. There were times she actually should have straight up killed Kenjaku, but her own output was lost, and even after reverse curse technique, she was still suffering from this damage drawback.
Yeah, and everything you just said was really spot on, and it was just really well said. EnemyStandUser actually has a whole video on how strong Yuki is he made recently, so actually I would recommend checking that out. Now, since this is the Yuki section, how she would actually win, at least the way I see this going is, obviously, let's just say base to base, Yorozu is a bit faster, right, but at least that's still relative. And of course, with the bog armor, she should be a decently amount faster, but not too much faster. But I will say Yorozu might actually be underestimating Yuki in the beginning, and even with the bog armor, Yuki likely would actually be able to land a hit. Now, this is very important because now it depends on how much damage Yuki is going to take. Now, of course, it's not like Yuki can actually punch with infinite mass every time, as had she actually been using that much punch, even for the first Kenjaku punch, it would have blown off Kenjaku's head, but not just that, it would have destroyed the entire barrier and probably the continent, or that chunk of the earth. So to some extent, she unfortunately does have to limit herself, though she can let loose more so because it's in the barrier, just like she did with Kenjaku. But considering the fact that the first punch that Yuki landed on Kenjaku, it did actually break both of his arms and injure his face, but didn't blow it off, I do think that it would completely destroy the bug arm, and it would actually do some pretty decent damage to Yorozu after, so it might not just rough her up, but it would actually maybe crack a bone or two. But regardless of whatever you think, or even if you think it takes off her hand, which is also a possibility, obviously then it comes down to the fact that does Yorozu have reverse curse technique, and if she does, then she's fine, obviously she just heals, or if she doesn't, she's gonna be screwed because she just took a large amount of damage. Let's just assume that she doesn't in this case, because this is the Yuki section. It's gonna be likely that she's gonna deem Yuki as a incredible threat and go right for the true sphere, instead of remaking a bug armor because she's gonna be injured. Now, what would happen if Yorozu's true sphere were to come into contact with Yuki's infinite mass punch? And there's two possibilities, one that favors Yorozu, one that favors Yuki. And I'll actually let EnemyStandUser take it from here and actually explain why it's likely, and it's also what I think is gonna be the truth of what would actually happen.
And Yorozu's true sphere is an insanely broken ability. This is actually a cracked technique, and it's an impossible concept. And it's kind of like Yuki's mask in that way, that it ignores the laws of physics. Even Yorozu mentions that it is truly impossible to make. I remember a chapter note gave an example of how a certain perfect sphere would operate in reality. It has an infinitely small point of contact on the surface area, so in turn, anything that touched it would be under infinite pressure and eradicated from that impossible force. As an example, there is also a difference in the contact point of something like the surface area of a needle compared to your finger if you touch something like a balloon. Of course, with a needle, the balloon would have a greater chance of popping, but compared to your finger, it has a larger surface area and would be harder to pop. So this sphere is akin to that needle, but it has an infinitesimally small contact point which would crush anything that it touches. It's interesting if this was up against Yuki's mask though, because Yuki has this mask that is uncontainable and beyond the scope of definition. It completely ignores concepts themselves, and this is a concept-based technique and ability. So then the concept of a perfect sphere probably would not work on Yuki in theory if Yuki is in that Bambaya state, in my opinion at least. Perhaps she would have to cripple Yuki first, or try to neutralize Yuki's curse technique in a domain expansion for it to really have a real effect on Yuki.
Again, considering Yuki's technique ignores concepts, she should be fine, just as how Mahoroga, because it had adapted to the concept of the liquid mel, in the same way how then he was able to actually get close to it. I do think Yuki would just punch right through the liquid mel. Yorozu would be like, oh damn, this is it's looking like it's GG, and then she would most likely be finished. And again, she wouldn't have reverse curse technique to heal in the beginning, so she would be physically injured. Even if she tried to make the bug armor, the injuries that she had from the first punch wouldn't have healed, and it would just be easy pickings for Yuki at that point. Even if they decide to have a domain clash, obviously it's hard to say who would win, but at the very least, because they're both closed domains, it wouldn't be an instant win for Yorozu, and especially if she's so injured, Yuki would have that advantage. And of course, if her arm happened to be the thing that got broken or fractured from the punch, it's gonna be tough for her to cast Domain Expansion because Yorozu actually needs both of her hands to actually cast Domain. So yeah, it's really incredible that Yuki would actually stand a really good chance. I could actually even win in a lot of scenarios, especially if Yorozu doesn't have reverse gust technique. She actually would be a top tier Heian era sorcerer. So yeah, mad props to Yuki. She does actually do a lot better than Yuta in this case. Big ups to her. And of course, if you've been enjoying the video so far, hey, be sure to leave a like and also be sure to subscribe. It's done on JJK content, and also check out EnemyStandUser too. He has been cooking this video. Okay, now for the Yorozu section. And of course, in this part, it's going to be all of how strong Yorozu is, all of her win conditions, and she's going to have reverse gust technique in this part. So Yorozu actually is confirmed to have Mai's construction technique. And even though Yorozu is someone who is very strong, it's very unfortunate that this is a technique that uses cursed energy output insufficiently. And I do want to clarify, there is a confusion for some fans who think this means, oh, does Yorozu have low output or is her actual overall output insufficient? No, it's actually confirmed by the narrator that Yorozu's output generally, or just her overall output for herself, is actually amongst the highest tiers of the strongest sorcerers in the Heian era. So of course, there's two types of output. There's your overall output, which affects your physical attack power and your defense, and you could argue maybe it to some minor extent it affects your speed. Some people don't believe that, but at the very least, attack power and defense, it does do that. And then of course, you have applying that output to your actual curse technique, and it's clarified by the narrator itself that it's the second part that's inefficient due to the technique, and the first part is actually great. Now, obviously, due to this inefficiency, she has to use a technique to a very efficient extent, which is why she makes a lot of bug stuff like bug armor and using a lot of biologically made substances in her bug armor, which are made from various things, because bugs can use energy efficiently. In this bug state, she's actually so strong that 15-fingered Sukuna doesn't actually want to fight her in terms of hand-to-hand, because he does take the first punch, which was to adapt to the bug armor. But after he had adapted after that first punch, he had no reason to actually take the second kick, where he actually summons Divine Dogs and tries to attack her, but she goes around him, actually somewhat blitzes him, not a bad blitz, but it's actually a pretty decent blitz, and then smacks him right in the face and blood comes out of Sukuna. But of course, this is just physical stats. We see Sukuna actually gets a very menacing and somewhat serious face, and after that, he used the 10 shadows to completely bully her and destroy the bug armor. But it is important to note that after the bug armor is out, he actually does not engage in physical combat with her whatsoever and uses the 10 shadows specifically to actually destroy it and to bully her that way, which is obviously a very powerful technique, a very smart thing for him to do. And of course, the two biggest feats that she has are actually both statements from the narrator, I guess GEGE himself. First one is just in terms of actually how much cursed energy she has and her actual output. Generally, she's actually amongst the highest tiers in the Heian era, the strongest era, so that's very impressive. And of course, the other most impressive thing, honestly probably the most impressive thing I'm going to say about Yorozu, with the bug armor, Yorozu defeated a force directly serving the Toe or the Fujiwara, the 5 empty generals, or the translations I prefer, the 5 void generals. And this is a squad which equaled the sun, moon, and stars led by Uro, or the celestial squad. And I do want to remind you, from this statement, obviously this is a squad because they're called the 5 void generals, they're generals, all 5 of them have a similar title, so they're all probably similar in strength, and considering that their leader is probably close to Uro, it is extremely likely, or actually just pretty much confirmed, that all 5 of them are actually either very close or some may actually be stronger than Uro. So a weaker version of Yorozu, keep in mind this is before she joined the Fujiwara clan and before she trained and got a lot stronger. She actually had a 5v1 against 5 Uro and Ryu level characters, and she won somehow, which is honestly, that alone, that statement alone is absolutely crazy to think about, and it is by far her biggest feat, especially because it's a weaker version of herself that actually did this. And of course, this is a really weird and odd buff for Yorozu, which many characters don't have, but since she fought 5 high-level elite sorcerers from the Heian era in a 5v1-1, this actually means she's very well used to and can easily fight multiple opponents at once. Unfortunately for characters like Yuta and Yuki, have an advantage in most fights because they 2v1 because they have Riko or Garyuda, it's actually not going to matter in this case because Yorozu is very well adapted to fighting multiple opponents at once, so the 2v1 won't be too much of a help. For the Yorozu part, assuming she does have it, it is possible that after she heals, she decides to remake the broken bug armor, and she decides to keep fighting Yuki with the bug armor. And keep in mind, the bug armor, not only is it faster than Yuki, but it should actually damage her pretty well. I mean, if it was making Sukuna bleed, Yuki's curse technique doesn't give her increased defense, so that is one win condition where she just makes the bug armor again, doesn't let herself get hit because she's now aware of how dangerous Yuki is and wins that way. And another way is if Yorozu decides to use a sphere, how that would interact with Yuki.
So there's a couple of holes when it comes to what Yuki is void of and what she can ignore as far as it comes to her curse technique concept and what can she be void of. Some examples of what Yuki can ignore would be like projection sorcery, the ratio technique, maybe even idle transfiguration, because those specific abilities use concepts to target opponents specifically. Now, Yorozu's sphere is not something that would specifically target anything, like it's applying to a specific opponent. She creates this concept and it's there, and now it interacts with the environment. So it begs the question of how would Yuki even interact with a concept such as that if her curse technique ignores concepts? There might be a situation where because the concept isn't targeting her, it's just naturally there, it might actually affect her because it's not specifically targeting her. And there are some things that actually affect Yuki, like things that are naturally there, like curse techniques like infinity, sky manipulation, even a non-curse technique like Kashimo's lightning, because those abilities just manipulate power or manipulate something that is naturally there. So Yorozu's sphere actually has a chance, like theoretically, you could lean either way. It could not affect her because her curse technique is immune to concepts, it can't be contained, or you could actually argue because it doesn't target Yuki that she is actually susceptible to being hit by that true sphere, which would definitely do some damage to Yuki if it was actually able to damage her.
So yeah, everything is really well said. It's a very odd loophole within Yuki's technique where it specifically said it's only when a concept targets her. So exactly like EnemyStandUser said, it's a very smart thing he actually pointed out while we were discussing this. I didn't even notice that. But again, it's only a possibility that I could do it, so that's why I could go either to Yuki or to Yorozu. Now, as for how a domain clash would go, it's a bit hard to discuss because there is the headcanon argument that maybe Yorozu is more refined because it's from the Heian era, but that hasn't been said anywhere and it hasn't been confirmed by anything. But I'll let EnemyStandUser actually cover how this might go.
So in terms of a domain expansion clash, this is actually super interesting because Yuki is no slouch when it comes to her barrier techniques and a barrier user, and Yorozu is a very experienced and very refined barrier user. As we saw her barrier technique, her domain expansion, that threefold suffering, that was just OP. And I think if these two fighters entered a barrier clash with Yorozu and Yuki, it would be very interesting to see if it was actually equal and they actually had their barriers clash. And since their barriers would clash in this theoretical fight, their sure hit techniques would cancel each other out and they would likely clash, and they'd both receive a 120% buff in their own abilities. But here's the thing, in my opinion, Yuki has a pretty good advantage in that domain battle because she has Garuda, her innate mass, and Yorozu's sure hit, that true sphere, might not in theory actually work because Yuki's technique is immune to those concepts. If they were completely equal, they had buffs to their techniques, Yuki technically should have a little bit of an advantage if we're taking it like that. And even after a domain expansion, when they use their curse techniques and they're burnt out, Yuki still has Garuda and all of her physical stats, and she even thought this was a viable option when she was fighting against Kenjaku too. So I think this is one scenario where Yuki does possibly have an advantage.
And yeah, everything's well said. It does make it really close, especially considering the fact that we know Yorozu's domain is now a closed domain and Yuki's is most likely obviously a closed domain too, which is why Tengen actually didn't want it to clash with Kenjaku. And we know that Yuki's is most very likely also a closed domain. So yeah, that does actually make it very likely that the clash would be pretty even. Obviously, you know, listen, I'm a big Yorozu fan. To give a bit of wank to Yorozu, I do think she would do better because her curse energy output and how much she has is amongst the inner top tiers, and maybe she'd be more refined. But EnemyStandUser actually does make some great points. How Yuki actually was also someone who developed a whole simple domain, like she actually invented a new type, or at least branched out a new breed of it. So that is very impressive. It's really weird because Yorozu does still have the sphere that's made before the domain, so even if she can't use it as a sure hit, she would still have the sphere. So then obviously it goes into, do you think Yuki can just punch through it because she ignores the concept, or do you think Yuki wouldn't be able to because it's not targeting her? Then it pulls back to those. And then obviously the 120% buff would make Yuki's attack power stronger, but then Yorozu, her bug armor would be faster and stronger. So it really does seem like it just goes back to the main point, because again, when the domains clash, it's not going to change much because in theory it should be pretty even. Okay, and now for some final thoughts about how this fight would go. So I'll pass to EnemyStandUser.
So I find this battle is a little weird because of how Yuki would kind of scale to Kenjaku. She was obviously keeping up with Kenjaku and she did some significant damage. It's weird how you would scale Kenjaku because she did some significant damage to Kenjaku, but it's kind of weird how you would scale them because Yorozu seems so much faster. I think Yuki has better attack power, but she's not nearly as durable or doesn't have that actual prime physical strength that Yorozu has showcased. It's pretty interesting because I think Yuki versus Yorozu is, at least when you don't consider their techniques, it's more in favor of Yorozu given how she is as a baseline. She has amazing cursed energy. She was from that Heian era and she had a lot more going for her. But Yuki still today, she is great. She has that amazing curse technique with Banbaya. She has domain expansion, reverse curse technique, and she actually did endure that domain expansion with Kenjaku. So it's interesting how they scale together. I do think Yorozu is a little faster. She might even be more physically stronger, but they both have their gives and takes when it comes to scaling.
And for my closing points, I do think it's a lot better than Yuta versus Yuki. Even though I do have Yuta being stronger than Yuki, Yuki fans, you better thank God that she didn't scale to Ryu or Yuta in the actual story directly. Because yeah, her just scaling to Kenjaku and only Kenjaku is actually a massive blessing for her. And not just that, but her tanking, just as EnemyStandUser said, that sure hit from Kenjaku just point blank with no defense. And just her not passing out, it is incredible endurance from her. And of course, she has reverse curse technique, so she can heal from that, even if the output does drop. So Yuki does have a lot going for her, and of course, so does Yorozu. It all really just depends on reverse curse technique, and then of course, how they interact with the True Sphere. But regardless, it is still a close fight. It's a fight that could really go either way, which is really great to see. But hey, whether you disagreed or agreed, let us know in the comments. Who'd you got winning, Yuki or Yorozu, and why? Big shout out to EnemyStandUser for coming off for the video. As you heard in the video, he's really great at analysis, and he has great breakdowns on his channel about JJK. So trust me, if you haven't already, and if you're a fan of JJK or even this channel, you're gonna love his channel. Check him out. And hey, if you watch this far and you're not subscribed to me, subscribe to us both. And of course, thank you to all of the channel members too. It is much appreciated. You guys really do help out the videos. Thank you very much. But that's all. Have a nice day, guys, and take care. Bye bye.